Well, the Minister of State for Environment, Dr. Iziaq Salako, now joins us to discuss what Nigeria stands to gain from the recent trip to Kenya, challenges Nigeria faces when it comes to stopping wildlife crime, and how to address it, as well as Nigeria's wildlife policies, among other issues. Good morning, sir, and thank you very much for joining us on the morning show this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic. I'd like for you to share with us some of, the key takeaways that Nigeria has benefited from that visit which you led to Kenya, and also share with us some of, the efforts that have been made to boost income from tourism. We also understand that your ministry unveiled that ambitious 10-year National Elephant Action Plan to tackle the alarming decline in Nigeria's elephant population and other wildlife crimes. I'd like for you to share with us some of those wins and gains.
All right. Thank you once again. The visit to Kenya, which happened earlier in the year, around August, was a very productive visit. It was an eye-opener. First, we were able to establish that for us to be able to conserve our biodiversity, we need a very, very strong legislative framework. It's not as if we do not have laws. We have laws seated in some of our agencies like NESRA, like the National Park Service, that help us to conserve our very rich biodiversity. But it has become apparent that we need to pull all those laws together into one document and strengthen those laws. And that is already ongoing at the National Assembly. There's already an endangered species conservation and protection bill being considered by the National Assembly, which we hope that very soon will be passed and then will be presented to Mr. President to assent. So we're able to establish that from that visit. Again, it was also clear to us from that visit that conserving our biodiversity is a multi-sectorial, across society thing. Not one agency of government or one level of government can actually get it done. So we saw that cooperation needs to be strengthened, and that is going to reflect in the law. Cooperation, collaboration between agencies like the Ministry of Environment, the National Environmental Standard Regulation and Protection Agency, the Nigeria Customs Service, the Nigerian Police, Immigration, Quarantine Service, and so on and so forth. Even the Financial Crime Agency also need to be brought on board for us to be able to prevent wildlife crime. So that was also a very strong message that we also got out from there. Again, we are also able to see that if we are able to work very hard, by the way, Nigeria has one of the richest biodiversity in Africa, and if we are able to work very hard and create that enabling environment to properly protect those biodiversity, conserve our wildlife, our flora and our fauna, we can actually promote a lot of economic activities and generate a lot of revenue around that. And you see that even private sector are involved in that effort. When we visited to Kenya, we saw quite a number of private conservancy who are generating substantial revenue from just ecotourism. So that was one big lesson that we're able to bring back. So I believe that for Nigeria, as the biggest country in Africa, with our land mass and our very biodiverse ecosystem, this is one area that will situate very well with the agenda of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu to diversify the economic base of our country. And we think that ecotourism can contribute significantly into achieving that.
All right. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. I'd like to clarify if the trip that you undertook in August, if it involved the Honorable Minister for Tourism, Ms. Lolade John. I'm asking because in Kenya, where you went to, wildlife is part of the Ministry of Tourism over there, while the Ministry of Environment is with climate change and forestry. I get the point that part of what you were trying to do was to also look for ideas regarding the draft of the Nigerian Endangered Species Conservation and Protection Bill for this year. But then you know that wildlife in Kenya is essentially about tourism. And you mentioned the idea of ecotourism and how that can be a revenue, generating machine for Nigeria. So was the Minister of Tourism with you on that trip? Were people from the Ministry of Tourism there so that the lessons that you are bringing back to Nigeria won't just be for your ministry alone, but will also be for the Ministry of Tourism that is expected to actually activate the revenue-generating component of what you went to do?
Well, you know that that visit was actually facilitated by a UK-based non-governmental organization, the Environmental Investigation Agency. And the primary focus of that visit was with respect to the Conservation and Protection Bill for endangered species in Nigeria. And you know that there's no one system that is uniform across the world. In Nigeria, protection of endangered species, conservation of our ecosystem sits with the Ministry of Environment. So it was just the Ministry of Environment and agencies of the Ministry of Environment related to conservation, and of course the legislative arm of the government of Nigeria, the Senate and the House of Rep, that are in charge of the environment sector within that the National Assembly, that were part of that visit. I must let you know that when we talked about tourism, tourism per se, what we are trying to do is a very small part of it, because what enables tourism is beyond conservation and protection. You have several aspects of it, from immigration, from how you even get your visa, from security and all that. So that is a bigger picture of it. But we have just gone there with the mindset of a narrower picture in terms of protection and conservation of our endangered species. So we also saw that in the course of that, we saw that when we are able to do that, it can support the Ministry of Tourism in the promotion of ecotourism.
Okay, so if we're looking at this high-level delegation's visit to Kenya, what would you say are the specific strategies or the best practices that you observed that Nigeria could also adopt, not to only boost tourism, like you said when answering Mr. Steve's question, but also in safeguarding our wildlife from poaching and habitat destruction? Following this trip, what should Nigerians expect in terms of a timeline for tangible improvements in our wildlife protection efforts? What can we expect to see the impacts of these lessons that we learned from Kenya materialize in Nigeria's policies and practices?
Thank you very much. That's a very, very good question. The first thing is that, just like I said, the law, the legislative framework is very important, because it is the law that can actually be used to deter people who engage in illegal wildlife crime. And I think that from the progress that's been made in the National Assembly, if not before the end of this year, early next year, we should see the National Assembly go through that law. One big lesson that we saw when we went there is that we saw some of the weak points of the legislative framework in Kenya. Because one of the specific questions we asked them, what are the weak points? What are the areas you think that when we're enacting such a law in Nigeria, we should avoid? And what are the things that are missing in your laws that you think we need to incorporate? And that we're able to establish that. So the legal framework is the first step. The second step that we also saw is that it is important to ensure that the financial crime that is involved in wildlife crime is also pursued, if possible, independent of the wildlife crime itself. Because if you are pursuing somebody who is engaged in wildlife crime, if that person is still having access to his funds, is to finance, he is able to buy his way around and protect himself. So we saw clearly that in enacting our law, we must be able to ensure that there is a pathway to pursue the financial crime that are involved in it, because wildlife crime is an organized crime. So if you're able to block access to financing, it helps the execution and the prosecution of the wildlife crime itself. Of course, we also saw that there's a need for wide collaboration among ministries and agencies of government at both federal and the state and local government level. More importantly, we also saw that, importantly, the community that are host to some of these wildlife sanctuaries are deeply involved. If you get the communities deeply involved, and not just involving them, they must be economically involved. When they are economically involved, then they see it as a responsibility to protect, because they know that that protection brings some economic benefit to their communities. Those are very strong messages that we're able to come back with from the visit to Kenya.
All right, thank you, Honorable Minister. I like the fact that you mentioned that part of what you came back with was finding out directly from Kenya, particularly from the Laikipia county that you went to, the weak areas of their own laws, so that we wouldn't have to repeat the same thing. I'm interested in what you find out, given what is known about wildlife in Kenya. We know for a fact that all wildlife in Kenya is owned by the state legally. There's little of private sector in it. I'm also aware that the conversation, that platform, media platform, had published an important story recently about wildlife in Kenya, stating some concerns about the fact that Kenya's wildlife conservancies make old men rich while making women and young people poorer. Did you find out things like that, and how will you reflect, how will you improve on the weak areas in terms of legislation in Kenya when it comes to the things that you are trying to propound in Nigeria?
First is that I do not totally agree that the involvement of the private sector in Kenya is not strong. What I saw was a very strong involvement of the private sector in Kenya conservation. Yes, the wildlife, even in Nigeria, wildlife is owned by the government, but the involvement of the private sector is very strong in Kenya, to the extent that we visited, I think, Pajeta Conservancy, which is owned by private investment, and I cannot remember the size. It was a very large area, and they have, I think, the few existing northern white rhinos in the world, the entire world. Only 2 are still existing, are in that conservancy, which is a private sector investment. So you have a very, very strong involvement of the private sector. One of the key areas that we were able to see as a weak point, that when we're doing, that we need to ensure that we protect against, is the area of that financial crime aspect of wildlife crime. Yes, Kenya has a mechanism that's able to pursue that financial crime aspect of the wildlife crime, but they were advised that the implementation of that is not strong enough, and that it may be necessary that when we are promulgating our own law, we need to strengthen that aspect of the law, so that aspect, because it is when you are able to block the access to funding, access to finance, that will make it easy for you to track those criminals that are engaged in wildlife crimes. So that is one area. Of course, the involvement of the community is one other area that we need to strengthen. Yes, like we have said, how do we ensure that it is across society involvement, not just involving the rich people, but getting community to be the owners of the involvement? That is one area we also need to address when we are doing our law. And I think that is one weak point that we found in the Kenya law, and a few others that we found like that.
Well, all right. Well, we'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Salako, for joining us on the morning show this morning. Thank you very much indeed.